Hi everyone, welcome back to another video with Steps Academy. I'm Edwina and today we'll be covering microeconomics in IB economics, but we'll more specifically be covering market equilibrium and then be talking about things regarding shortages and surpluses. So first of all, what is market equilibrium? We first of all need to define it in order to score well in our essays and also internal assessments. So let's define what market equilibrium is. Market equilibrium is when the quantity demanded for a product is equal to the quantity supplied of a product. So QD stands for quantity demanded, QS stands for quantity supplied. And so market equilibrium is when the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. Meaning that is that there are no shortages and there are no surpluses. What you may ask, are shortages or surpluses? Well, we'll be covering that later on in the video. But in market, when the market is in equilibrium, there are absolutely no shortages or no surpluses. And regarding market equilibrium, only non-price determinants of supply and demand will change the equilibrium point. So only non-price determinants of supply and demand, meaning only shifts in the supply and demand curve, will change the equilibrium price, because we know that non-price determinants of supply and demand will shift the curves respectively, shift the respective curves, of course, and that would in turn change the equilibrium price. Otherwise, the equilibrium price would not change. And so what does the graph look like? Well, obviously we need to label the axes. And so we have the upward sloping graph, the curve of supply, downward sloping graph of demand, and their intersection point is where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. And so here we can label it as PE and QE standing for equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity respectively. And so this is the point where supply is equal to demand, as in the intersection point between the two curves, meaning that the quantity demand is equal to the quantity supplied, meaning that it is the market equilibrium. And so we write QE is equal to equilibrium quantity, while PE is equal to the equilibrium price. And at equilibrium, the price will not change. And when the market is at equilibrium, when the free market more specifically is at equilibrium, price will not change whatsoever. And so let's talk more about this. What happens if there, say, is a shortage? Now, what is a shortage? A shortage is excess demand. And actually, excess demand and shortage are interchangeable, so you can use either phrase within your essay. Both are completely fine. So you can say there has been an excess demand or there has been a shortage. But make sure you do define what a shortage is. And a shortage is when quantity demanded is greater than the equilibrium quantity. Because the cause of this is because price is less than the equilibrium price. When price is lower than the equilibrium price, it means that it's relatively cheap. And so a lot of consumers would want to purchase this good because it is considered as relatively cheap. And so there would be a lot of demand for that good. And therefore, because price is lower than equilibrium price, there is more quantity demanded than at equilibrium, because more people want it since it's at a lower price. And so we can visually depict this on a graph, of course labeling the axes S, D, and here we will have mark PE and QE because we do need to be able to compare the equilibrium versus where the shortage is. And so when there's a shortage, it's because price is lower than equilibrium price. And since we know the cause of this, we can start off by drawing a line right here indicating it's P1. And so we extend that further and see where it intersects D and where it intersects the S curve. And so that's where the quantity demanded is, and that's where the quantity supplied is. And so this is the point where the price intersects with demand. And so that's the quantity demanded at that specific price point. So this is quantity demanded at P1. This is quantity supplied at the price of P1, because this is where the price intersects with the supply curve. And therefore, we can see that there's a difference between quantity demanded and quantity supplied, because they're both not at equilibrium quantity. And so we see here that there is a shortage, and we can visually depict this by doing this. And this line right here, this little shaded area, is the shortage. But what is the actual numerical value of the shortage? How much are we short of? How much is the excess demand? Well, excess demand or shortage, both of them are interchangeable, is equal to QD minus QS. Because we are demanding, quantity demanded is right here, yet we're only being able to supply over here. Why? Because suppliers don't want to supply a lot when the price is so low. It's not profitable for them. And so that's why quantity supplied is so much lower than quantity demanded. And so you see there's a disparity, there's a clear disparity between quantity demanded and quantity supplied. And therefore we have excess demand equals to quantity demanded minus quantity supplies, and that's the amount of shortage. And so what we need to do to amend this, to fix this, and to reach market equilibrium, it's for the producers to actually raise the price. So producers need to raise prices from P1 to PE, meaning from P1 to PE right here, in order to lower quantity demanded. Because if you raise prices from P1 to PE, quantity demanded will decrease, indicating a contraction of demand. Why is it a contraction of demand? Because quantity demanded decreases. And you can see that it's a movement along with the demand curve, because it's a movement due to the price mechanism. And you can see that when price increases, there's actually an expansion of supply, meaning that there is more quantity supplied at the higher price point, because it becomes more profitable to supply at a higher price point of PE rather than P1. And so we see here that is how they would amend a shortage. Now, we can also move on to a similar idea regarding surplus, as in excess supply. So let's talk about surpluses, which is basically the opposite of a shortage. And so it is excess supply. And so what this means numerically is that quantity supplied is greater than quantity at equilibrium. So quantity supplied is greater than equilibrium quantity. But why is that? The root cause of that is because price is greater than the equilibrium price. Now, price is greater than the equilibrium price, meaning that producers are more willing and able to supply, and therefore they supply at QS rather than QE, because QS is greater and it becomes more profitable since price is higher. And so we can draw a graph to visually depict this, obviously labeling every single curve, every single axis, marking where the equilibrium is so that the examiner know what we're trying to compare. We're trying to compare a surplus versus when the market is at equilibrium. And so we have the excess supply, meaning that price is greater than PE. So let's say price is right here. And so we draw a line, And we see where it intersects the demand curve, and we see where it intersects the supply curve. And so where it intersects the supply curve is quantity supplied at that specific price point. And where it intersects the demand curve, it's quantity demanded at that specific price point. And so we can see that there is a clear discrepancy between quantity supplied and quantity demanded, because neither of them are at equilibrium quantity. And so we can use a highlighter to highlight this section, and this section just represents our surplus. But the amount of surplus is actually the difference between quantity supplied and quantity demanded, because we know there's more quantity supplied. And so the difference is QS minus QD, and that is the difference between supply and demand at that specific price point of P1. And so there is a surplus, and that means there's too much of the product within the market right now because of such a high price point. And so what we need to do is producers need to lower the price from P1 to PE in order to lower QS. This is because if they do lower the price, they won't waste their resources, because right now they're creating so many goods that a lot of them aren't being purchased because the quantity demanded is only at QD, whereas the quantity supplied is at QS. And so they're producing way more than the market needs and what consumers want. And so they're wasting resources. And therefore, producers would need to lower their price from P1 to PE, where the quantity demand is equal to the quantity supplied, meaning that there are no waste of resources and that there is no loss, and that they are instead profiting, because rather than wasting resources and losing the potential profit from such wasted resources and wasted products that aren't purchased, they can actually instead produce at QE. Producing at QE, PE means that there's no excess, and meaning that all their resources are being put to good use. And so if they do decrease the price from P1 to PE, this represents a contraction of supply, because it is a movement along the supply curve and quantity supplied is decreasing. But this also represents an expansion of demand, because quantity demanded is now increasing from QD to QE. This is because the price decreases, and so more consumers are more willing and able to purchase at a lower price point. And so now we have covered surpluses, what they are, and what you should be drawing if a question does ask you about surpluses. You always have to make sure to remember to draw your graphs and to label all the curves, all the axes, and anything else you need to label. And so next, we need to discover how we reach equilibrium. How does that occur? So our next topic is reaching equilibrium. EQM stands for equilibrium, by the way. And so a surplus or shortage will cause price to change. Well, how does price change? Price changes until market equilibrium can be reached, because that's how the free market, to be more precise, will respond to a surplus or shortage. So for a shortage, meaning there's excess demand, price will increase. This is because of the excess demand, meaning that the price is too low and that people are demanding way too much of it, and suppliers aren't willing to supply that much of it because it's not profitable to supply at such a low price. Therefore, during a shortage, they will need to increase prices. The free market will increase prices on its own in order to eliminate the excess demand. In comparison, regards to a surplus, the price will need to decrease. The price will need to decrease because there's too much being supplied in the market, and the quantity demanded does not match the quantity supplied. because quantity demanded is pretty low at such a high price point in comparison to such a high quantity supplied, because producers are willing to supply at very high price points because it's more profitable for them, and therefore price will need to decrease in order for quantity demanded to match quantity supplied. And the extent to which the price will move is until it reaches the equilibrium price point, because when it reaches the equilibrium price point, it represents that equilibrium quantity is also reached. And therefore, after such price movements do occur, QD will equal to QS, meaning that equilibrium has been achieved. And that's the goal. That's the goal the free market wants. It wants equilibrium. It wants all economic stakeholders to be happy. No one's unhappy. No one's demanding more than and not receiving the good. They're all happy. And therefore, quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied at market equilibrium. So, how do shortages and surpluses come about? Well, shortages and surpluses are because of non-price determinants of supply and demand that shift the curves, so shift the respective curves. And once it shifts the curves, before a new equilibrium is reached, temporarily there is disequilibrium where there is maybe a shortage or surplus, and so new equilibrium will be needed to establish. So will be needed. And so the market on its own will establish a new equilibrium once the supply and demand curves shift. And so let us illustrate this using an example. So let us draw a graph using an example. And let's say it is the quantity of jackets. And therefore, it's against the price of jackets on the y-axis. So we have supply and demand. And let's say it's winter, and so more people are demanding jackets. And so demand shifts outward to D2. So what happens now? Well, first of all, let's mark where the equilibrium point was. P1, Q1. That's the initial equilibrium with the curve S and the curve D1. And then temporarily, price will remain at P1 before the market can respond, because there is a time delay between increased demand and price changes, because the market needs time to respond. There's a time lag. And so here, it will temporarily be at Q2. Now, Q2 would be where demand would be. Q2 is where quantity demanded is when demand increase. As you can see, it's where quantity demanded is. However, temporarily, quantity supplied remains at Q1. Quantity supplied remains at Q1 when it's P1. Because when P1 intersects D2 right here. Whereas P1 intersects supply right here. Meaning that temporarily, this is demanded. Temporarily, this is supplied. And you can see that temporarily, there is a shortage because there's more demand than there is supply, because demand is at Q2 whereas supply is at Q1. And so there's a shortage. And so what happens here is that the market responds. The market responds by saying, oh wait, this price is too low because there's too much demand. The people are demanding too much of it while there isn't much supply because nobody's willing to produce at such a low price. And so this happens temporarily until the market responds to this. And so the market responds by increasing prices. And this is when producers will increase prices from P1 to P2. Here, a new equilibrium will be established. And this is the equilibrium. This one I'm highlighting right now is the equilibrium, is the new equilibrium, I should say. And so the new equilibrium will be established right here. And there we see that there was a temporary shortage. However, the market corrected itself, and so firms increased the prices in order to meet the excess demand, because seeing as there was excess demand, they would obviously wish to be more profitable, and they can see that if they increase prices, people would still be willing and able to buy it, because right now prices are too low and they're losing out on consumers who would otherwise be willing to purchase their goods. And so by increasing prices, more suppliers are willing and able to produce such a good, and quantity demanded will equal to quantity supplied, meaning that the number of people wanting jackets matches the number of producers supplying the jackets, and so the new equilibrium will be established. Now this is where there was a temporarily there was a shortage. And so this is just an example of where a non-price determinant of supply or demand would shift, causing a temporary shortage or a temporary surplus depending on which curve shifts and in which direction. And then you can use this to explain how market equilibrium is then established. So this is how you would use an example in your essays to say that, oh, this is there was an expansion, there was an increase in demand at all price points. However, it resulted in a shortage, therefore leading to a new equilibrium point being established because price was initially too low, and so they had to increase prices. This indicates that you should go about your essay as rather like a story to say, oh yeah, I went from Q1 to Q2 to Q3. And eventually, this is the new equilibrium point because the demand curve shifted outwards because demand was increased. And so that's how a new equilibrium would be established following a shift in the demand or supply curve because of a change in non-price determinant. And so now we can move on to the HL part of market equilibrium. And so this is HL. So SL people, that's it for the video, but HL, continue watching. So HL, this is where we talk about more regarding to paper 3. And so that this is just the equation to find market equilibrium mathematically. So equilibrium, we know, is when demand and supply intersect, because we know that this is the graphs we've been drawing. The graphs we've been drawing are where supply and demand intersect. And so PEQE is the equilibrium. And so we know that. And therefore we also know that the demand function is A minus BP. And we also know that the supply function is C plus DP. And so we know that the intersection point is when both equations are equal to each other. That is when D is equal to S, because that's when PE is equal to QE. And so D equal to S is also the same as A minus BP equals C plus DP. And that's how you find where the market equilibrium is when you're asked such a question in paper 3. So that's how you find the market equilibrium mathematically. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and that will be it for market equilibrium. And we will be continuing on with microeconomics in our next video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and leave your thoughts, questions about economics or anything else regarding the IB down below, and we'll try and respond. Thank you. Bye.